David, for that very kind and generous welcome. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I am likely, and after his introduction, I am definitely the most illiterate person here regarding science fiction and fantasy literature. My knowledge of this subject comes merely from some schoolboy science fiction reading, as well as movies of Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Harry Potter, but not a whole lot to write home about. But in obedience to the request to speak of His Eminence, Daniel Silver, I offer to you what I have. In thinking about what that offering might be, I was reminded of the Underground Man in Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. In his soliloquy, this insightful yet highly unpleasant person asked, quote, "Of what can a decent man speak of with most pleasure? Answer, of himself. Well then, I will speak about myself." Unquote. I have always been concerned about reality, what is real and what is not. I will share to you tonight the development of my own understanding of reality, God, man, and life, but not in that order. Perhaps you will see some of your own struggles mirrored in mine, and hopefully some of the things I've learned may be useful in your own development. I am sure that a few of us have had experiences in life when time stood still and the ground seemed to open beneath our feet. For me, that was when I was just entering my freshman year in engineering college and I lost my mother to a heart attack. Before that, I had been a fairly simple guy, mostly occupied with friends, studies, and basketball. Now I became quite serious at the ripe old age of 17, engaged within myself with questions of what is life? Wondering, what is reality anyway? I suppose that many post-adolescents go through a similar questioning period, but this one literally hit me without warning between the eyes. I was a math and science geek, but now I turned increasingly to literature for understanding the world and why it is the way it is. To make a long story short, I found point and counterpoint in the writings of two widely disparate authors, Ayn Rand and Fyodor Dostoevsky. No, I did not think to find it in the pages of the Gospel until sometime later. I'd like to tell you a bit about that fictional and sometimes fantasy literary journey. Rand and her 1,000-page dystopian novel Atlas Shrugged occupied me for most of a semester, competing with differential equations and nuclear physics. It wasn't much of a competition. It was not a great semester grade-wise. I couldn't stop reading. Even Sunday nights were spent avidly listening to Rand's weekly address on WKCR FM New York, King's Crown Radio, the voice of Columbia University. I think I have some reel-to-reel tapes of those talks. I only need to find a player in order to listen to them. In the words of her closest associate, Leonid Peikov, quote, "Ayn Rand held that art is a recreation of reality according to an artist's metaphysical value judgments. By its nature, therefore, a novel is a self-contained universe, aloof from commentary, beckoning the reader to enter, perceive, respond," unquote. Rand formulated a fantasy world ruled by governmental compulsion and philosophical mind control. She labeled the symbols of these evil forces as looters and moochers, the looters taking property by force, and the moochers who claim it by tears. The businessmen, scientists, and engineers, the men of the mine, also known as the prime movers in capital letters, were ruthlessly placed under submission, with a product of their inventive efforts, such as patents, expropriated by the state. Rand's criticism of altruism went the next step. The creative ones had to willingly and enthusiastically give up their work, since everyone was expected to live not for oneself, but for others. The men of the mind eventually went out on strike, bringing the world to its knees. Their leader was a character named John Galt, who appears only near the end of the novel, but who is the subject of the often asked question, who is John Galt? In the end, the men of the mind win, and the final scene has Galt tracing the sign of the dollar over the earth. Obviously, there are Christian, or rather anti-Christian, allegorical themes here, which one can reject, embrace, or ignore. I chose to ignore. I grew up in the Orthodox Church from 40 days old. My parents were Russian Orthodox. I went to Sunday school. I was an altar boy. Granted, most of the services were in a language I did not understand, namely Church Slavonic. But I did have a Russian English service book, which at least carried me through the Sunday Divine Liturgy. But my theological knowledge, as well as my experiential understanding of God and Christ, was still woefully inadequate. Rand spoke to my inherent egotism, my hostility towards compulsion and any form of injustice, as well as my romanticism for a better time, a better place. The opening music for her radio show was the second scherzo movement of Sergei Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony. Who could not be inspired by Rachmaninoff's lyrical and heroic tones to strike out at all the enemies of free will and creativity? I was hooked and read all that I could of her works. I even watched the 1949 movie version of The Fountainhead with Gary Cooper, Patricia Neal, and Raymond Massey. The book was much better than the movie. I seriously considered joining her Objectivist Society, a fringe group if there ever were one. Fortunately for me, the tide turned shortly thereafter when we were assigned in college civilization class to read Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I was captivated by the raw emotion and psychological anguish of the hero, or rather the anti-hero, and the internal fantasy world he inhabited. Here was a man I could relate to in my own internal struggles to understand the world, myself, and my relationship with it, particularly regarding the enlightened self-interest and utopian tendencies of the West versus the independence of chosen irrationality. One of the great loves of the underground man was the equation 2 + 2 = 5. I didn't like him much personally, but that was beside the point. As you will continue to notice, God did not yet enter the equation. Soon I was reading many of Dostoevsky's works, The Idiot, Crime and Punishment, The Possessed, and his crowning glory, The Brothers Karamazov. Ayn Rand became a distant, yet at times nagging memory. Compared to the inner struggle and depth of Dostoevsky's characters, Rand's simply fell flat. As Nicholas Berdyaev noted, quote, Dostoevsky shows us man's nature only in a state of exaltation, and after such pictures, everything seems savorless and flat. It is like coming back to our own three-dimensional, organized world after visiting another and different universe, unquote. Now, you might want to interrupt me and ask, both Rand's world and Dostoevsky's are fiction, not fantasy. Where are the elves, dragons, and princesses? I thought we were supposed to speak about fantasy here. Now, as I understand it, fantasy leads the reader in a totally free-form universe, unhindered by worldly reality, to discover certain truths about good and evil, love and hate, enmity and friendship, all according to the fundamental presuppositions and worldview of the author. Having a good read may or may not be peripheral. In this way, J.R.R. Tolkien is considered to be a Christian author, as Dostoevsky is, and Rand is decidedly not. But each of them carefully constructs their fictional or fantasy world in an effort to inform and convince others and perhaps themselves, of their presuppositions. In Dostoevsky's case, his understanding of self and the world developed over time, as expressed in his novels, again culminating in the Brothers Karamazov. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote in his 1939 lecture on fairy stories, quote, "The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. Beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril. Both joy and sorrow sharp as swords. In that realm, a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of the traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gate should be shut and the keys be lost," unquote. For Dostoevsky, the realm that he constructed and investigated was the human mind and heart. That was his fantasy world, if you will, a world in which, as he stated, quote, "God and the devil are at war, and the battlefield is the heart of man," unquote. He probed man's alienation from society in the underground man's soliloquies in his dilapidated flat, viciously attacking the outside world while struck with self-loathing. He delved into the conscience of the double murderer Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, who was initially self-justified by his radical and nihilistic views, but later confesses his crime. He constantly explored the male-female relationship, which, using Tolkien's words, was unavoidably caught up with, quote, "beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril," unquote. He blew apart the conventional image of the harmonious family in the Brothers Karamazov, with its themes of hatred, immorality, nihilism, madness, and patricide. Recall the sarcastic title of part 1 of the novel, A Nice Little Family. For me, up until finishing the final chapters of the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's fantasy world of psychological insights into the human mind and heart were both magnetic and terrifying. I could not look away, and my soul stirred deeply when particularly anguishing episodes were related. The possessed, or in another perhaps better title translation, the demons, refers in the words of Mikhail Bakhtin, quote, "to the ideas that possess them, non-material but living forces that subordinate the individual and collective consciousness, distorting it and impelling it towards catastrophe," unquote. In this case, those non-material but living forces, which began in fantasy, inexorably escalated into reality with the events preceding, during, and following the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Nicholas Berdyaev, in his commentary on Dostoevsky, described the Russian people as, quote, "not comfortable in a temperate psychical climate, their constitutions driving them inexorably, irresistibly towards extremes. The same tendency to excess, the same desire to push things to their logical conclusion, forced them to the opposite poles of looking for the realization of a new heaven and earth, and of nihilism. Can such a people ever be happy as a people?" Unquote. I wondered, was Berdyaev right? Was there nothing positive here, something to take away and to feel happy about? Yes and no. The tragedy of human existence was laid bare in its most basic and fundamental forms by Dostoevsky. Admittedly, he was able to shine some points of light in certain of his characters. Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, Shatov in The Possessed, Sonia in Crime and Punishment, and of course the monks Zosima and Alyosha in the Brothers Karamazov. Each of these displays some virtue, simplicity, kindness, a desire to recover the Slavic Christian heritage, loving concern, faith, or humility. After all these excursions into new and intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually challenging fantasy worlds, I was still left unfulfilled. Somehow, the reality which I sought was still beyond me. In some Russian stories, an enticing yet dangerous creature called the Will-o'-the-Wisp appears. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Professor Remus Lupin warns against a particularly aggressive form of these creatures termed inkypunks. In the Russian novels, these mysterious apparitions, composed of some luminous material, some scientists say phosphorescent swamp gas, acts as a magnetic force on travelers in unfamiliar vistas. The traveler follows the will-o'-the-wisp, but as it leads into a dark and threatening place, it suddenly vanishes, leaving the unwary pilgrim completely without compass or direction. Even with the best of Dostoevsky's characters, I felt still an incompleteness of my internal search, a void which remained even after the anguish, the tension, the tragedies, and yes, the small victories of love and mercy and kindness. At the end of Dostoevsky's culminating, brilliant work, The Brothers Karamazov, the father is dead, murdered by the half-brother Smedyakov, who then commits suicide. The innocent Dmitri is found guilty of the crime and is exiled to Siberia. The atheist Ivan descends into madness. The novel concludes with the youngest brother, Alyosha, giving a stirring speech full of hope to a crowd of children. They cry, "Hurrah for Karamazov," as they hoist Alyosha on their shoulders. The end. Despite this joyful and perhaps naive conclusion, I remained unfulfilled. I asked myself, is that it? Is that it? At that point of questioning, I discovered, or perhaps rediscovered, the one who had been with me since I was 40 days old, my Lord and God and Savior, Jesus Christ. He was the one, after the great Russian writer left me, who took me by the hand and led me out of the swamp and into his presence, his silent presence, the same presence that he displayed in his encounter with the Grand Inquisitor. He did not need to speak. He is the one who is, the one who truly exists. He is reality itself. He is the one who enters our mind and our heart. So much of concern to Dostoevsky. That mind and heart cluttered with innumerable fantasies, dreams, nightmares, fears and hopes, sorrows and joys, and penetrates mind and heart with the uncreated light of his Spirit. Have you ever reflected upon the account of Jesus' disciples Luke and Cleopas on their first resurrection Sunday, walking along the 7-mile road from Jerusalem on the way to Emmaus? How their dreams were dashed when their teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, was put to death by the Romans. They had hoped for the restoration of Israel, but now that was all gone. Did they feel that they were following a will-o'-the-wisp when they followed Jesus? He said he was the light of the world, but now that light had been extinguished, and they are lost back in the swamp, in the torment and tragedy of their own minds. As they were walking along, they met a mysterious stranger who did not seem to know what had taken place these last days in Jerusalem. The stranger was Jesus, risen from the dead, but their eyes could not recognize him. They told him of their disappointments. They told him also of the story that the women related about seeing an angel at the grave of their master, saying that he was alive. But they didn't get it, despite being with Jesus all that time. "O foolish men and slow of heart," he called them. He then interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Was this a simple didactic exercise? Was this an academic lecture? Not at all. It was fire coming down upon them, the same fire that Jesus wished to cast down upon the earth. Jesus blessed and broke the bread and gave it to them. Their eyes were open, they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And what then did they say? Did not our hearts burn within us on the road when he opened to us the scriptures? The Greek word here for burn does not mean warm or cozy or even hot, but literally on fire. I came to cast fire upon the earth, Jesus said, and would that it were already kindled. This is not a nice story with a moral. It is an encounter, a personal encounter with the living God. I am forever grateful to Dostoevsky for having churned my heart and mind in the company of his tortured characters, and for allowing me to take part in their chaotic and wrenching lives. I am thankful that his fantasies of the heart and mind, delving deep into the innermost recesses of his 19th century Russian characters, tilled the soil of my own heart and made it possible to receive Christ there as the good seed and the holy fire. Nicholas Arseniev, the great Orthodox Christian apologist and theologian, said, quote, "The subjugating presence of Christ is at the center of the whole struggle for and against the acceptance of God in Dostoevsky's thought. He saw but two issues, God or godlessness, and he also had the terrifying vision of a world which is void, void of sense, void of God," unquote. Several of Dostoevsky's characters recognized that if there is no God, then everything is permitted. The vision of that anarchy and ultimate emptiness could only be overcome by the experience of the presence of Jesus Christ and the new life which comes from him. J.R.R. Tolkien, in the epilogue to his lecture on fairy stories, refers to the Gospels as containing, quote, "a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories," unquote. Or, as I think we would call them, fantasy. He is somewhat apologetic that this, in his words, quote, "particularly artistic, beautiful, and moving," unquote, "marvel has entered history and the primary world and has exited the secondary world of fantasy." He terms the incarnation and the resurrection as eucatastrophes, EU catastrophes, literally Greek for good destruction. He describes it as, quote, "the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears, which is the highest function of fairy stories to produce," unquote. The Gospels take us through a winding and sometimes confusing path to the realization of the resurrection eucatastrophe. Think about it. Is the Gospel story linear, proceeding inexorably and well organized towards its denouement? Is Jesus of Nazareth a consistent figure, allowing us as rational beings to gain increased confidence in his teaching? Or do we follow a jagged course, so contradictory at times, impelling us to look closely at this man who calls himself Son of Man and ask ourselves, who is he really? He says that he comes to proclaim the good news, but then speaks in parables, which he knows most will not understand. He praises the leader of the disciples, but then calls him Satan. He appears rude with his mother and family, yet is kind to a prostitute and eats in the homes of sinners and tax collectors. He claims to fulfill the law, but is then accused of disobeying it. He asks us to honor our parents, but then advises a man to not bury his father. He is disdainful of outsiders like the Canaanite woman, yet berates the insider Pharisees and scribes. He is forbearing to the woman caught in sin, but harshly scolds his disciples. "O foolish men, slow of heart, how long do I have to be with you? How long do I have to put up with you?" He says many things that are offensive to our ears, but he adds, "Blessed is he who takes no offense at me." And he is the one of whom was said, "No man ever spoke as this man." Who is this Christ anyway? He puts us and our faith to the test. He asks us to see him as he is. He does not ask us to detect themes in his parables or his actions. He does not entice us to resonate with his personality and to want to spend time with him. He does not attract us by being a nice guy. No, he challenges us, sometimes brusquely, sometimes harshly, with nothing but his solitary presence, the presence of the one who comes to the outcasts, the poor, the meek, the suffering, the brokenhearted. He offers no comfort except that of his own outcast self, his own poverty, his own broken body and spilled blood, his own just being with us in our fears, sorrows, and tragedies. He offers no victory except that of his own resurrection, accomplished through the suffering and death on the cross, bursting the doors of hell, trampling down death by death. He opens for us the pathway into the kingdom of God, enabling us to see glimpses into the kingdom through our own hopes, joys, and love for one another. And sometimes, the only response that we have when we truly encounter Christ, using J.R.R. Tolkien's words, is to be pierced in our heart with a joy that brings tears. Well, that's it, my friends. That's my story, my path through the workings out of the puzzle I call, what is reality? There's more, but I think that I've said enough for tonight about my pilgrimage. In closing my talk, however, I offer some practical advice. Be aware of the will-o'-the-wisp and the temptations to be drawn into places, even wondrous and fascinating places, where we may find ourselves in danger. By danger, I mean the conscious withdrawal or unconscious absence from God and our encounter with his presence, especially on an ongoing basis. Can we resist being caught up in the exciting world of fantasy, in the rush to read the latest book, to see the latest movie? Can we withstand the temptation to go after the next new thing? Or can we take the time each day, as Inigo Montoya said in The Princess Bride, to go back to the beginning? Back to the beginning, which is, in our case, to simply be with the one who gave himself for us so long ago and continues to sustain us today. I have no doubt that you are all voracious readers. C.S. Lewis gave us some advice in his introduction to the English translation of St. Athanasius on the Incarnation. He wrote, quote, "It is a good rule, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one until you have read an old one in between." Unquote. I'll say that again. It is a good rule, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one until you have read an old one in between. Unquote. A really good old book is the Holy Gospel. Better yet, don't just read, but immerse yourself in the gospel of Jesus Christ, just as you would immerse yourself in some of the fantasy stories that you love and cherish. And allow his Holy Spirit to draw you into the depths of his presence, the reality of the one who is perfect peace, joy, and love through his cross and resurrection. As Dostoevsky said, God and the devil are at war, and the battlefield is the heart of man. You have your own fantasy adventure going on in your own heart. May God be victorious. Thank you.
To offer opportunities to ask questions, entertain dialogues, well, any sort. Feel free.
Are you going to print that somewhere?
Am I going to print that somewhere? Maybe. Yes, sir.
It's very easy when reading Dostoevsky to see the Christian themes and imagery all over his work. In your reading of Ayn Rand, did you find anything that was, I know she's hostile to religion, but nevertheless, what did you find in there that maybe pierced you a little bit spiritually?
The question is, when I was reading Ayn Rand, although she's not Christian, she's anti-Christian, was there anything in there that kind of pierced me spiritually? Well, I'll use the example. Once I was interviewing a very, very well-known priest, Father John Narabecki, now blessed memory, for a strategic plan that I was going to. I know that there was not to be any business here. For I was conducting for St. Vladimir Seminary, and he said to me, one of the best things that you could do would be to invite experienced priests to come to the seminary and talk to the seminarians. So I said, Father John, who would you recommend? He says, it doesn't matter. You can invite good priests, you can invite bad priests, and the seminarians will learn from each of them. And I presume what he meant was you'd see the good guy and you'd say, I want to be like him. You see the bad guy and say, no. So Ayn Rand was a bit that way once I got my head straight. Yes, Father Nick.
Father Peter, thank you for a richly textured set of remarks. Really, there's so much there. Obviously, our society is troubled. And if you were a doctor who could write a prescription for reading, that every American should read a particular book other than the Holy Gospel and the Bible, what would you recommend to help us get on the right path?
Well, I wouldn't like to use the words other than the Holy Gospel. What book would you recommend other than the Holy Gospel?
As a gateway drug.
As a gateway drug. Well, that is quite difficult, I guess. For me, the seminal book that I had read when I was coming back into the Orthodox Church was Father Alexander Schmemann, For the Life of the World, which talks very heavily about the holy mysteries, the sacraments. He opens up, and I'll just tell you what really got me. The opening paragraph quotes the German philosopher, material philosopher Feuerbach. And Feuerbach said, man is what he eats. And what Feuerbach meant was that he's just, blood and corpuscles and proteins and amino acids, carbohydrates and so on. That's it, period. But what then Father Schmemann was doing is leading us into the whole concept of the Eucharist, to eat the body and blood of Christ. And again, just remember, and again, this is part of the tremendous, I don't want to say complexity, but almost like it is eucatastrophe. It is so powerful. When you read the words of the gospel, and say when Jesus said to his disciples, and who's talking to many disciples, except you eat my body and drink my blood, you have no life in you. And I think one of the most tragic but most compelling sentence after that is, and many of his disciples no longer walk with him. And Jesus is that challenging presence, but we as Christians, we must recover that challenging presence in our life, because we need to be shaken out of our lethargy, we need to be shaken out of our indifference, and the only way to do that is to truly encounter Christ. So I would say that, but of course I love Dostoevsky. So if you want to read Dostoevsky and go through that challenge, go for it. But you've got to have a lot of energy to do that. So, yeah. Thank you, Father.
I read Ayn Rand for a bit in high school, and it made me really want to be an architect for a little bit. It seems like she just has a romance about materiality, including in the anthem, where she's so enchanted by the idea of discovering electricity. Do you think that romance, that enchantment with the material world itself, has kind of a kernel of truth that if she followed that more, she might have been led to think more about the creator of this materiality? Or do you think it's purely a distraction?
Well, I think knowing more about Ayn Rand's life, which I came to know later on after she faded into the recesses, the dark recesses She was not a nice person in the least, and she would be the last person that I'd want to follow. But I think that she was so set by her approach and her principles, she couldn't be possibly swayed. But again, even there are a lot of people who departed from her, so to speak. But the idea of materiality is something which always hit me, because as an engineer, I dealt with reality. I dealt with, you're going to build a bridge, you better make sure it doesn't fall down, And so you had to you wanted beauty in someone. The school I went to was a combination school, a school of engineering, art, and architecture. It was called the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, the Union of Science and Art. And so we were constantly being told that not only do you need to build something which withstands the test of time, it's got to be beautiful, and it's got to fit with the landscape. It's got to be architecturally sound. It's got to be artistically gorgeous, and it's got to be strong. So I was raised that way. And the issue with, I think, Ayn Rand is that she was really worried about free will and creativity. And unfortunately, at the time, especially she was coming out of communist Russia, where there you had no free will and you had no creativity except what the state told you to do. So in a certain way, she was influenced by that. But there's not a whole lot redeeming, except she's one of the bad priests that you don't want to listen to. Yes, sir, I'll repeat it.
Well, thank you. Sorry. Just as the reporters all right there. Thank you for your presentation. All I wanted to ask was, how much of Dostoevsky and how much of Dostoevsky and others who have written similar works of fiction, things like that, to do with the off-point, God-shaped hole in our hearts, seeking our Creator through every avenue, and sometimes meaning, fantasy, and things like that. Do you think that there's a part in all this, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it certainly does. I mean, we're not Gnostics, we're not Manichaeist, where we think the material things are evil, and the only things that are good. We're not Platonists, etc. God, and you read Genesis, God made the heavens and the earth, all that is within, and the birds of the air and the beasts of the field and so on. And behold, he saw it was very good. So the essential goodness of creation is there, and we recognize God's energies, his grace in that. But the thing is that we can't just look at it as it is. We have to look beyond. We have to look beyond at the Creator. And so, when we see, and again, the biggest thing here, and one of the issues that we have everywhere for all times, is the lack of love that we have for one another. And to the extent that we can see someone and we see the relationship that we have with them, and this is a huge thing, male-female stuff in Dostoevsky was, none of his characters ever got there. None of his characters ever were able to merge the physical and the spiritual aspects of love, ever. But that's the thing, that's the struggle that he portrayed, that I think, most of us have that issue. And so being able to see someone as truly the image of God, as the child of God. And I'll tell a real quick story. It's in my book, by the way. And it's the lead story in a chapter that's called How to Get Along with Disagreeable People. And it was a time when I was a graduate student at Syracuse University, and I was still going through all of this thing. And I was taking an overload of engineering courses. It was really tough. And it was springtime, and all the undergraduates were carefree. They were throwing frisbees around, having a great time, and there I was with a load of books under my arm, and so many projects to do. And I was feeling very curmudgeonly. I was the disagreeable person. But then, for whatever reason, I suddenly looked into the face of the person coming towards me on the path. And the thought came to me, this is a child of God. And then each person who came past me, I said to myself, child of God, child of God. And after about 2 or 3 minutes, I had this huge grin on my face. I was jauntily running along the path, and everybody must have thought I was a Class A idiot. But You know, I just felt so much in tune with these wonderful people who I thought were anything but wonderful 5 minutes before. And that's the question. How do we approach creation? How do we approach our fellow human beings? How do we approach our family? How do we approach the people in our church? The poor on the street? As I mentioned tonight, the poor, the outcasts, the brokenhearted, and so on. God is there. God is there. I mean, one of the other books that I read, and I'll stop here with this, is Franny and Zooey, J.D. Salinger. And at the end of it, Franny and Zooey are having a conversation, and they're talking about who Jesus was, who's Christ. And the brother says to the sister, says, do you know who Jesus Christ is? Remember that old lady sitting on the stoop? She's heavy, she's overweight, she's fat, she's got cancer, and that's Jesus Christ himself. And when I first heard that, and our priest, Father John Kozak of blessed memory up in Syracuse, related that story to me, I was just blown away by it. Because to me, that was the example of how you see God in other people, and where that God-shaped hole in your heart gets filled. And it gets filled by Jesus working through other people, through the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, the flowers, and so on, but most especially by those people who you come in contact with each day. So, thanks.
Yeah, I've always thought that people who go through significant loss or just some significant event, life event that's extremely negative or negatively impact like in a negative way. I mean, I've always thought that the guys always use that to really make somebody kind of have a huge turning point in their life. I mean, depending on where the person is already. I mean, if you're kind of on the path of searching God and then something like that happens, I guess you can go one way or another. But do you feel that the passing of your mom was really just that kind of a turning point for you that made you do a lot of soul searching and maybe even opened you up more to receive?
It was a miracle. Had she lived until she was 90? I don't know. In some way, but at that point in time, that was what God had decided or allowed it to happen, and that's what it was. I mean, for some people, an event like that turns into extremely bitter. I know individuals who are that way, but somehow for me, that's what happens. And I pray for her each day, and the gift that she gave me through the 17 years that I had with her. And again, I think when you read the Gospels and you see what Jesus was, I mean, he was there for people who had trouble. You know, in life we kind of really are happy when everything's going well and everything's going swimmingly and we get all A's and, you know, we've got our degrees and we've got a great job and everything's going, you know, we have a wonderful spouse and great kids and so on and so forth. And if God has blessed us that way, that is just absolutely wonderful. And the only thing that we can do is just give thanks. Thanks. But we also need to give God thanks, just like St. Paul, you know, and give thanks for this messenger that God sent me in life to teach me what I'm supposed to do. So, but I think for us, God sent me, I don't want to say she sent me Ayn Rand, but he certainly sent me Dostoevsky, he sent me Father Alexander Warnicki, Father John Kozak, he sent me Tanya. I mean, let's face it, I'd be nothing without it. Zero. So, thanks. Question? I think the questions
first of all, sorry to say that I missed a portion of your early talk, but I think I got the most important part, which was my favorite essay of all time, which I will admit is probably because I don't read whole essays, but is on fairy stories by Tolkien. And one of the questions I had, the question I had for you was that a significant portion of his essay is involved in discussing the writing of fairy stories, he goes a lot into writers of fairy stories as sub-creators. When we were talking about reading advice, do you have any writing advice for people who would be sub-creators, create fairy stories in this kind of thing?
Yeah, the question is, do I have any advice for people who want to be sub-creators, not creators at the God level, but creators of fairy stories, of important things that need to be said? I would say that you need to have a wife. That's the first thing. You need to have a wife who says, Peter, or a husband, a wife or a spouse, I should say. Spouse is such a, but a husband or a wife that keeps you on task and says, you have a job to do, and you have a responsibility to do it, and you better get off your rear end and do it. And who creates, who makes an environment. Just as use an example, we visited our daughter in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, outside of Minneapolis, and we were there for about a week. And I have a feeling that my wife Tanya had spoken to her about it ahead of time. And as I came in, she says, Dad, I've got this wonderful little space on our patio downstairs. I have a nice desk and a reading lamp, a place for you to put your computer, and we won't bother you for 4 hours a day. And you can do whatever you want down there. Hint, you know. So, but that's the thing. I mean, anyone in a family who's going to do something like that has to have a cooperative family. And God has blessed me with the family that I have. And so, yeah, that's what I would say. And the other thing that I would also say is, for those of us who are Christian and want to have a Christian element, is to try to somehow pray that somehow gets in there. Because I'll tell you the fact, this will-o'-the-wisp is really a serious thing. We can easily get drawn into something, and then suddenly that thing disappears, and we're left God knows where, and we're lost, and we can't have that. So we need people, we need encouragement in order to not do that. See, I'm old, but I can still run.
So regarding this will-o'-the-wisp, you talked about will-o'-the-wisp as a serious danger. Then you also said that for you, Dostoevsky served as a will-o'-the-wisp, then left you stranded to allow Christ to meet you.
Exactly.
So is this, like the good priest, bad priest thing, or can the will-o'-the-wisp serve a useful function and even a godly function in helping us have that encounter?
Yeah, most definitely. I think it can serve a godly function, but the thing that for me was a little bit dangerous was that, as I mentioned, I said God did not enter the equation, and I ignored the gospel and so on. Even though I was quote unquote, everyone would have said, oh, that Peter, he's such a nice altar boy, and it was such a nice, well, there were years I didn't go to church, except on Christmas and Easter, so I'm very sympathetic to that. But the thing was that it was really a miracle for me to get dragged out of it. But there are times when you've got to see whether that life raft or that life preserver is there, and as you're going through it, you still have it. But it is a dangerous thing, I think. It is a dangerous thing. I've seen people who have gone off the deep end, quote unquote, from a Christian point of view, just because they followed something and then they were disillusioned and so on and so forth. And what is it all about anyway? One.
You talk about the will-o'-the-wisp, and I think that the will-o'-the-wisp, I mean, from a science fiction point of view, is dangerous, just like, philosophy books can be dangerous. And so the question is how do you tell? I mean, the reason we're attracted by the will-o'-the-wisp is because there's something that we perceive some good in it.
Absolutely.
And I mean, as human beings, we're curious. I mean, that's what distinguishes us more than just about any other animal, other than maybe cats. So the idea that the will-o'-the-wisp, I mean, how do you distinguish between the good and the will-o'-the-wisp? that, I mean, is in our, you know, we have that God-shaped hole in our heart, that, and God is good, and that's why we're attracted by the will of the Lord. I'm wondering, can you offer any clues on what kind of question we can ask ourselves? Is this will of the wisp a real danger, or is it actually improvement toward God, as it should? Because Tolkien would say that the fairy tales are that.
Fairy tales have the will of the wisp in them, for sure. But I think what he was talking about is this huge catastrophe of being the way that you break out of that secondary world, of the secondary reality to the primary reality. And the interesting thing was that in that essay, as I said, he was very apologetic because he liked to stay in that fantasy world. He didn't want to go back out, but as a Christian, he wanted to do that. Well, again, I think that we have all kinds of will of the wisps in our life. Just bringing it down practical, not just reading philosophy or whatever. Will of the wisp can sometimes be other people. It can sometimes be relationships that we really shouldn't be having, but we're having them because of certain things. Certain jobs that we might have, certain ways of dealing with people can be will of the wisp. We can be, speaking again, shouldn't talk about business, but you could be an authoritarian manager, and you could probably get things done, but there will come a day when you will come to ruin. You can follow casual relationships for the rest of your life, but ultimately you're going to be lonely, and your life could be ruined. In one of the Psalms, Psalm 104, it says, "You have made wine to gladden the heart of man, and oil to make him a cheerful countenance." The wine to gladden the heart of man can be a will of the wisp. It can be something very nice. Russians are famous for vodka. Vodka is very nice when you have some colleagues and you're knocking back the vodka shots, and it can be an awful lot of fun. But it can be life-destroying, home-destroying, family-destroying. So, but the whole point here, and let me just make another business kind of reference. When we do creative thinking, like brainstorming, if we're having a group of people and we're trying to generate a creative idea, we're willing to follow whatever the will of the wisp anybody comes up with, because there is no such thing as a stupid idea. In fact, sometimes we say, when we're really stymied, come up with an idea that if you presented it to your boss, you would immediately be fired. That's kind of the test of a real crazy idea. But the thing is that at some point in time, it's got to be brought down to earth. When I do this with church groups, I say, constantly check your thinking, especially as you're getting near the end with the Holy Gospel. What does the Gospel say? And that, for us, that's the rule book. I mean, not a rule book, but it's the book of our best knowledge of the presence of Jesus Christ in our life. And that's why we pray. We say our prayers in the morning, we say our prayers at night, we say the Jesus prayer or something during the day, constantly trying to anchor ourselves in something. And in the Christian life, there is freedom. We are free to do things. We are free to think things. We're free, just as I do all the time, to criticize our bishops, or to criticize the way we do things in the church. But you have to be grounded in Christ. It can't be something that comes out of your own irascibility, your irritation, your inner nastiness, or something like that. It's got to be something that really comes out of a love for the other person. So I'm not sure whether that's a good answer, but it's the best I can offer right now. Father,
Yes, thank you very much, Father.
Okay.